He thought this would be routine, just another forgettable passenger passing through his line. But in less than 60 seconds, the system he trusted would force him to question everything he thought he knew. The terminal at Gate C pulsed with movement, a steady rhythm of rolling suitcases, muted conversations, and overhead announcements echoing across polished floors as travelers hurried to catch flights stretching thousands of miles across the country. And right in the middle of it all stood Olivia Hayes, quiet, unassuming, almost invisible in a worn brown coat that hung loosely over her frame. Her canvas tote resting against her side, as if it had seen more years than most of the people rushing past her. Mark Sullivan adjusted his posture behind the security checkpoint, his navy uniform crisp, his badge catching the sterile white light above as he scanned the next passenger in line, his eyes moving quickly, efficiently, until they paused, just for a second too long, on Olivia. There was something about her that didn't fit his mental checklist, not polished enough, not hurried enough, not like the business travelers with tailored suits and expensive carry-ons, or the families juggling kids and snacks and boarding passes. And without saying a word, he made a decision that felt automatic, justified, even necessary. "Ma'am, step aside please," he said, his tone firm but edged with quiet authority, the kind that didn't invite questions. Olivia stopped mid-step, her gaze lifting slowly to meet his, steady, calm, almost unreadable, and for a brief moment, something about that composure unsettled him, but he brushed it aside, gesturing toward the secondary screening area where fewer eyes lingered but enough remained to notice. Around them, the line shifted, a businessman in a tailored gray suit glancing over with mild curiosity before stepping forward as if grateful it wasn't him, while a young couple whispered softly, their voices blending into the ambient noise of the terminal. Olivia followed without protest, her steps measured, unhurried, as if time moved differently for her. And when she placed her bag onto the inspection table, her hands didn't tremble, didn't hesitate. They simply rested at her sides while Mark began his routine, unzipping compartments, checking contents, performing the motions he had done hundreds of times before. "Purpose of travel?" he asked, not looking up. "Personal," she replied, her voice even, controlled, offering nothing more. Mark's jaw tightened slightly, the lack of detail irritating in a way he couldn't quite explain, and he continued, "Flying alone?" "Yes." Short answers, precise, no explanation, no defensiveness, and somehow that made it worse, as if she wasn't trying to prove anything at all. He paused, glancing at her ID again. The name Olivia Hayes printed clearly, unremarkable, ordinary, and yet something about the stillness surrounding her felt out of place, like a quiet room before a storm no one else could see. Behind them, the hum of the airport continued, indifferent, unaware, but in that small corner near the checkpoint, the air seemed to tighten just slightly as Mark turned toward the terminal screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to run a deeper check, convinced he was about to confirm what he already believed, that she was exactly who she appeared to be, nothing more, nothing less, and completely unaware that with a single keystroke, he was about to step into something far beyond. Routine. Mark Sullivan had learned to trust patterns more than people, and right now Olivia Hayes did not match any pattern he respected, not the rushed business traveler checking a watch worth more than a month of his salary, not the anxious family juggling boarding passes, and certainly not the confident frequent flyer who moved through security like it was second nature. She stood there instead with a stillness that felt deliberate, as if she had nowhere to be and nothing to prove, and that alone made him uneasy. He continued his inspection with more precision than necessary, unfolding neatly packed clothes, checking the seams of her bag, even pausing to examine a simple notebook tucked in the side pocket, its pages filled with tidy handwriting that revealed nothing but ordinary lists and notes. Yet he lingered longer than required, as though expecting something hidden to reveal itself under pressure. Around them, the line continued to move. A TSA agent waved the next passenger through, a child laughed somewhere in the distance, and the overhead speaker announced a final boarding call for a flight heading west. But in this small space, time seemed to slow, stretching the moment into something heavier than routine. "You travel often, Miss Hayes?" Mark asked, finally looking up, his tone casual but edged with quiet suspicion. Olivia met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unchanged. "Sometimes," she replied, her voice calm, measured, offering no further detail. And again that restraint unsettled him more than any defensive reaction would have. He glanced down at her identification once more, turning it slightly under the light as if the angle might reveal something new, but it remained the same, a standard government-issued card. No visible indicators, no special markings, nothing that justified the subtle tension building in his chest. A fellow officer, stationed a few feet away, cast a brief glance in their direction, raising an eyebrow as if to ask whether assistance was needed, but Mark gave a small shake of his head, unwilling to admit uncertainty, especially not in front of colleagues or the growing number of curious eyes nearby. "I am going to run an additional check," he said, his voice firmer now, reclaiming authority, and without waiting for a response, he turned toward the terminal, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. Olivia remained exactly where she was, her posture relaxed but upright, hands loosely at her sides, watching without interruption, and that silence began to feel louder than any protest could have been. The system loaded slowly, a spinning icon reflecting in the glass of the screen, and Mark exhaled quietly, tapping his fingers once against the desk as he waited, already convinced the result would confirm his judgment, that this was nothing more than a precaution, a necessary check to maintain standards, and yet something about the stillness behind him made it difficult to focus. He could feel it without turning around, the way the air had shifted, the way conversations nearby seemed to soften just slightly, as if the moment was holding its breath. Then, without warning, the screen flickered, the loading icon vanished, and for a fraction of a second, everything froze, the cursor blinking against a background that had suddenly changed, its color deepening, darkening, and Mark leaned in, his brow tightening as unfamiliar text began to populate the display. Not the usual verification results he expected, but something else entirely, something that did not belong in routine checks. And as his eyes moved across the lines, the confidence he had carried just moments before began to fracture, quietly, almost imperceptibly, right there under the sterile white lights of the terminal. The screen did not return to normal. It did not display the routine confirmation Mark had expected. Instead, it shifted into something colder, more deliberate, a deep red banner stretching across the top with bold white text that did not belong in everyday operations. And for a moment he simply stared, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing as the words resolved into clarity. Priority protocol activated, followed by a string of identifiers he had never encountered in his years on duty, and beneath it, a directive that felt less like a suggestion and more like an order: do not proceed without supervisory authorization. Mark's fingers hovered above the keyboard, suddenly unsure, the confidence that had guided every move just seconds ago slipping quietly out from under him as a faint alert tone sounded, soft but unmistakable, drawing the attention of the nearest terminal where another officer paused mid-scan and glanced over. The air shifted again, this time sharper, heavier, as if something unseen had just entered the room, and Mark instinctively straightened, his posture tightening as he tried to regain control of a situation that no longer felt routine. Behind him, Olivia Hayes had not moved, not even an inch, her presence steady, almost detached, as though she had already seen this moment unfold before it ever began, and that stillness now felt different, not passive, not uncertain, but quietly assured in a way that made everything around her seem louder by contrast. "What did you run?" A voice called from several feet away, firm, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to raise volume to command attention, and Mark turned to see Rachel Green approaching, her pace measured but direct, her expression focused as her eyes flicked from the screen to Mark and then briefly to Olivia. For a split second, Mark considered minimizing the display, pretending it was a minor system error, but the alert remained, pulsing faintly, impossible to ignore, and he stepped back slightly, giving Rachel a clear view. She leaned in, her gaze scanning the information with practiced efficiency, and whatever she read there caused the smallest shift in her expression, not shock, not confusion, but recognition, immediate and unmistakable. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone not paying close attention, but to Mark it felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. Rachel straightened, her posture aligning with a level of formality that had not been present moments before, and when she spoke again, her tone had changed, sharpened into something precise and deliberate. "Did you initiate secondary screening without cause?" she asked, her eyes still on the screen. Mark hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the silence around them to deepen, enough for the watching crowd to sense that something had gone wrong, even if they did not understand what. "It was a routine check," he replied, though the words felt thinner now, less certain, as if they no longer carried the weight they had before. Rachel did not respond immediately, her attention returning to the display, reading through the protocol line by line. And then she did something that Mark had never seen in this context before. She stepped back, turned slightly toward Olivia, and for the first time since arriving, addressed her directly, her voice measured, respectful, and unmistakably different from the tone that had filled the last several minutes. "Ms. Hayes," she said, a slight pause following the name as if confirming it carried more meaning than it appeared. "I need to verify one thing before we proceed." Olivia met her gaze calmly, offering a small nod, and in that moment, with the red alert still glowing behind them and the terminal around them growing quieter by the second, it became clear to everyone watching that this was no longer about a random check, and whatever Mark Sullivan had just triggered was something far beyond his authority to control. For a moment, no one moved, not Mark, not the nearby officers, not even the passengers who had been whispering just seconds before, because something in Rachel Green's tone had changed the atmosphere entirely, turning a routine checkpoint into a space charged with quiet tension, the kind that made people instinctively lower their voices without knowing why. Olivia Hayes stood exactly as she had before, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but now that calm carried weight, as if it belonged to someone who understood the situation far better than anyone else in the room. Rachel took a small step closer, her eyes steady, her voice measured. "Can you confirm your travel authorization code?" she asked, each word precise, deliberate, as if following a script that only a few were trained to recognize. Mark felt his pulse quicken slightly, his attention shifting between the two women, trying to make sense of a conversation he clearly was not meant to fully understand. Olivia reached into her coat pocket slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, and retrieved a slim card, nothing flashy, nothing that would stand out at a glance, but as she handed it over, Rachel accepted it with both hands, a subtle gesture of respect that did not go unnoticed. The difference in treatment was immediate and undeniable. Rachel glanced down at the card, then back at Olivia, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something that had already been suspected. Behind them, the red alert on the screen remained active, its glow reflecting faintly off the polished surface of the terminal, a silent reminder that whatever had been triggered was still in effect. Mark shifted his weight, suddenly aware of how exposed he felt, how every decision he had made in the last few minutes was now being quietly reevaluated under a different light. "This protocol requires clearance acknowledgement," Rachel continued, her voice now carrying an authority that extended beyond the immediate checkpoint, and without waiting, she turned slightly toward the terminal, entering a sequence of commands that caused the system to respond instantly, lines of encrypted text appearing and disappearing faster than Mark could follow. The efficiency of it all made one thing painfully clear: this was not unfamiliar territory for her, and more importantly, it was not unfamiliar territory for Olivia either. A nearby officer took a step closer, curiosity overtaking caution, but Rachel raised a hand slightly, not even looking in his direction, and he stopped immediately, as if an invisible boundary had been drawn around the scene. Olivia remained silent throughout, her gaze steady, not demanding, not defensive, simply present, and that presence now carried a quiet authority that no badge or uniform could replicate. Mark swallowed, the dryness in his throat catching him off guard as he finally spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier confidence. "Is there an issue?" The question hung in the air longer than he expected, and when Rachel finally looked at him, her expression was composed but firm, the kind of look that did not need to raise its voice to correct someone. "There is no issue," she said, pausing just long enough for the words to settle. "But there is a protocol that has just been activated, and it overrides standard procedure." The implication was clear. What had started as his decision was no longer his to control. Another alert tone sounded, softer this time, almost like a confirmation, and Rachel handed the card back to Olivia with the same careful respect. "Thank you for your cooperation," she added, her tone now formal, almost courteous, a complete departure from the tension that had filled the space moments ago. Olivia gave a small nod in return, and for the first time since the interaction began, there was the faintest shift in her expression, not satisfaction, not relief, but something quieter, something closer to recognition, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. Around them, the terminal began to move again, conversations slowly returning, footsteps resuming, but the shift had already happened, the unspoken realization spreading through those who had witnessed it, that the quiet woman who had been pulled aside moments ago was never what she appeared to be, and that sometimes the system itself knew exactly who deserved to be questioned and who never should have been. Mark Sullivan stood frozen for a fraction longer than anyone else, even as the terminal slowly returned to its usual rhythm, because something inside him had not caught up with what had just happened. The authority he carried only minutes ago now felt thinner, almost misplaced, like a uniform that no longer fit the situation. He glanced at the terminal again, the red alert now replaced by a neutral interface, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. And yet the memory of those words still echoed in his mind, the kind of message that did not belong to everyday operations, the kind that was not meant for someone at his level to trigger. Olivia Hayes adjusted the strap of her canvas bag with a quiet, effortless motion, her composure unchanged, as though the entire interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause in her day, not an incident that had drawn the attention of multiple officers and shifted the tone of an entire checkpoint. Rachel Green stepped slightly to the side, creating a clear path forward, her posture now formal, almost deferential, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "You are cleared to proceed, Ms. Hayes," she said, the words simple, but the weight behind them unmistakable. Olivia met her gaze for a brief moment, offering a small nod, and then she turned, her steps steady as she moved past the checkpoint without hesitation, blending back into the flow of passengers, yet somehow no longer invisible, because those who had witnessed the moment now watched her differently, not with curiosity, but with a quiet respect that had not been there before. Mark remained where he was, his hands resting against the edge of the inspection table, the faint imprint of the moment still pressing against his thoughts, and for the first time since he had taken this position, he questioned not the procedure, but the assumptions that had guided it. Rachel turned toward him, her expression composed, but there was a firmness in her eyes that made him straighten instinctively. "Routine checks are not based on impressions," she said, her tone calm but precise, each word deliberate. "They are based on protocol." Mark nodded. Though the motion felt heavier than usual, the lesson landing in a way that no formal training ever had. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come easily, because there was nothing to defend, nothing to justify, only the quiet recognition that what he had considered instinct had, in this moment, been something else entirely. Around them, the checkpoint resumed its steady pace, passengers stepping forward, bags sliding across scanners, announcements echoing overhead, but the space felt different, as if something subtle had shifted beneath the surface, something that would not be visible the most, but would remain with those who had seen it unfold. A fellow officer leaned closer, lowering his voice just enough to avoid drawing attention. "What was that about?" he asked, curiosity edging into his tone. Mark hesitated, his gaze drifting briefly toward the direction Olivia had gone, already disappearing into the crowd, and then back to the terminal in front of him. "Not routine," he replied quietly, the words simple, but carrying more weight than anything he had said all day. Rachel turned away without further comment, returning to her station with the same composed efficiency as before, but the brief exchange lingered, not as a reprimand, but as something more lasting, a recalibration of understanding that did not need to be repeated to be remembered. And as the line moved forward and the next passenger stepped into place, Mark Sullivan adjusted his stance, not with the same rigid certainty as before, but with a quieter awareness, one that recognized that sometimes the people who appear the least significant are the ones the system recognizes first, and that respect, once overlooked, has a way of returning in silence, leaving behind a lesson that no one in that terminal would easily forget. Olivia Hayes moved through the terminal with the same quiet pace she had carried from the beginning, her figure gradually blending into the current of travelers heading toward their gates. Yet the space she left behind did not immediately return to normal, because for those who had witnessed what had just unfolded, something subtle had shifted in the way they saw everything around them. Mark Sullivan watched her for a moment longer than necessary, his gaze following the simple brown coat as it disappeared into the distance. And in that brief stretch of time, he replayed every decision he had made, every assumption that had led him to pull her aside, each one now standing under a different light, stripped of the certainty he had once attached to it. He turned back to his station slowly, the routine motions of his job still there, still expected, but no longer automatic in the same way, as if a layer of awareness had been added that he could not ignore. The next passenger stepped forward, a man in a tailored suit, phone in hand, barely looking up as he placed his belongings on the conveyor belt. And for the first time, Mark did not immediately categorize him, did not assign value based on appearance. Instead, he paused, just briefly, allowing the process to guide him rather than his instincts. Rachel Green remained composed at her position, her attention shifting seamlessly back to the flow of operations. Yet there was a quiet watchfulness in her demeanor, as if she understood that moments like the one they had just experienced did not end when the person walked away. They continued in the choices that followed. A few feet away, the officer who had asked earlier still lingered with curiosity, but even he seemed to sense that the answer he had received was all he was going to get, and that whatever had happened carried a level of importance that did not invite casual discussion. The overhead speakers announced another boarding call, the familiar cadence filling the air, and the line advanced steadily, each traveler stepping forward into a system designed to treat everyone the same, at least in theory. But now that theory felt more tangible, more real, because it had just been tested in a way that exposed its limits. Mark adjusted the placement of the inspection bins, his movements more deliberate, more measured, as if each action now held meaning beyond simple repetition. And when he spoke to the next passenger, his tone was still professional, still firm, but there was a difference, a subtle shift that replaced assumption with attention. Across the terminal, Olivia reached her gate, presenting her boarding pass with the same calm efficiency, receiving a polite nod from the agent who scanned it without hesitation, unaware of the moment that had unfolded behind her, unaware of the quiet ripple it had created. She stepped onto the jet bridge without looking back, not because she was unaware, but because there was nothing left to address, no need for acknowledgement, no desire for reaction, only the continuation of a path she had already been on long before she entered that checkpoint. Back at security, the rhythm of the airport fully returned, conversations resumed, footsteps echoed, and the system moved forward as it always did. But beneath that surface, something had changed, something that could not be measured by procedures or screens, something that lived in the brief pause before judgment, in the awareness that not everything could be understood at a glance. And for Mark Sullivan, standing under the same bright lights with the same responsibilities, that awareness settled quietly into place, not as a dramatic realization, but as a steady presence that would guide every decision from that moment on. Because sometimes the most important shift does not come from what is said, but from what is finally understood in silence. The aircraft door closed with a soft, final sound that most passengers barely noticed, but for Olivia Hayes, it marked the continuation of a routine that had never truly been routine. Her seat by the window offering a quiet view of the runway as ground crews moved with practiced precision below, each motion coordinated, efficient, and unseen by those who did not know where to look. She fastened her seatbelt without hesitation, her movements calm, deliberate, the same composure that had carried her through the terminal now settling into the stillness of the cabin, where conversations softened and the low hum of the engines began to rise. Around her, passengers adjusted overhead bins, exchanged brief remarks, checked messages on their phones, unaware that among them sat someone whose presence had quietly activated systems they would never see, protocols they would never understand. A flight attendant paused near her row, offering a polite smile, the kind given to every passenger, equal and unassuming, and Olivia returned it with a small nod, Her expression unchanged, her attention already shifting inward, as if the events at the checkpoint had been filed away, acknowledged but not dwelled upon. Back in the terminal, Mark Sullivan continued his shift, but the rhythm no longer felt automatic. Each interaction now carrying a layer of intention that had not been there before, his eyes moving differently, not searching for discrepancies, but observing without immediate judgment, allowing the process to unfold before conclusions formed. Rachel Green observed from a distance, her posture composed, her attention steady, recognizing the subtle change without needing to address it, because moments like that were not meant to be repeated in words, they were meant to be carried forward in action. The system itself returned to normal operations, screens displaying standard information, alerts silent. Yet the memory of that brief red signal lingered in Mark's mind, not as a warning, but as a reminder of the boundaries he had crossed without realizing it. Boundaries that existed not to limit him, but to ensure that authority was applied with awareness, not assumption. On the aircraft, the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring, announcing a flight time of just under 3 hours, the route clear, the conditions smooth, and as the plane began its gradual pushback from the gate, Olivia's gaze remained fixed on the horizon beyond the glass, where the fading lights stretched across the tarmac in long, quiet lines. She did not reach for a phone, did not open a book, did not signal for attention. She simply sat, present in the moment, her stillness now blending seamlessly into the quiet routine of flight, indistinguishable from any other passenger, and yet entirely different in ways that would never be visible to those around her. The engines grew louder, the aircraft turning slowly toward the runway, and as it paused for clearance, a brief silence filled the cabin, the kind that comes just before motion begins, and in that silence, there was no trace of what had happened earlier, no sign of disruption, only the continuation of a system that had corrected itself without spectacle. Back at the checkpoint, the line moved forward, the flow uninterrupted, but for Mark Sullivan, the lesson remained, not as a moment of embarrassment, but as a shift in perspective that would follow him beyond this shift, beyond this terminal, into every interaction where appearance and assumption might quietly compete. And as the aircraft lifted from the runway, rising steadily into the evening sky, Olivia Hayes closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, not in reflection, but in the quiet certainty that the world often reveals its truths not in noise, but in the spaces where judgment pauses and understanding finally takes its place. At cruising altitude, the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm, the soft hum of the engines blending with the low murmur of passengers who had already returned to their routines, some scrolling through their phones, others resting, and a few staring out at the endless stretch of sky beyond the windows, unaware that the woman seated quietly among them carried a responsibility that extended far beyond this single flight. Olivia Hayes opened the small notebook that had rested in her bag earlier, flipping to a page marked with a thin strip of paper, her eyes scanning lines of neatly written observations, each detail precise, intentional, and far more significant than it appeared at a glance. There were notes about timing, about procedures, about subtle inconsistencies that most would overlook, but to her, they formed a pattern, a map of how systems behaved under pressure and how people responded when they believed no one was watching. She paused briefly, her pen hovering above the page, then added a single line, her handwriting steady, controlled, as if capturing something that did not need many words to be understood. A flight attendant passed by again, offering beverages, and Olivia accepted a glass of water with a polite nod, her focus never fully leaving the page in front of her. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his tie and leaned back in his seat, glancing briefly in her direction before returning to his own thoughts, seeing nothing more than another quiet passenger, and that was exactly how it was meant to be. Back at the airport, Rachel Green stood in a small office just beyond the checkpoint, the door partially closed as she reviewed a report on her terminal, the same alert now documented in a secure log, its details already flagged for internal review. Her expression remained composed, but there was a depth to her focus that suggested this was not just another entry in a system. It was something that would be examined, understood, and learned from. She replayed the sequence in her mind, the moment the alert had appeared, the way Mark had reacted, the way Olivia had not, And in that contrast, the real lesson became clear, not just about protocol, but about perception. Mark Sullivan sat at his station, the steady flow of passengers continuing, but every now and then, his attention drifted, not away from his duties, but deeper into them, as if he was seeing them for the first time without the filter of assumption. He recalled the exact moment he had decided to pull Olivia aside, how certain it had felt, how justified, and now, that certainty had been replaced by something quieter, something more thoughtful, a recognition that authority without awareness could easily become something else entirely. The system had corrected the moment without confrontation, without escalation, but the impact remained, not in the alert itself, but in what it revealed about the people within it. In the sky above, the aircraft moved steadily along its path, miles passing beneath without notice, and Olivia closed her notebook, resting it gently on her lap as she looked out the window once more, the fading light casting a soft reflection across the glass. She did not revisit the moment at the checkpoint, did not dwell on it, because for her, it was part of a larger pattern, one she had seen in different forms, in different places, each time revealing the same underlying truth. The world often measures people in seconds, in glances, in assumptions made too quickly, and yet the systems designed to maintain order rely on something deeper, something that cannot be seen at a glance. And as the aircraft continued forward, carrying passengers toward their destinations, the quiet lesson of that day traveled with them, unseen but present, a reminder that respect is not granted by appearance, but earned in the moments when judgment is replaced by understanding, and that sometimes, the most important authority is the one that operates without needing to be seen. The aircraft began its gradual descent as the captain's voice returned over the intercom, calm and steady, announcing their arrival time with the same measured tone that had guided the flight from the beginning. And as the cabin lights brightened slightly, passengers stirred, adjusting their seats, gathering their belongings, preparing to step back into a world that had continued moving without them. Olivia Hayes remained seated for a moment longer than most, her gaze steady out the window as the city below came into view, a grid of lights stretching endlessly in every direction, each one representing a story, a decision, a moment shaped by perception or by understanding. She closed her notebook and placed it back into her bag with the same quiet precision she had carried throughout the journey, her movements unhurried, unaffected by the subtle shift in energy around her. Across the aisle, the businessman straightened his jacket, checking his reflection in the darkened window, while a family behind her reminded their child to stay close once they landed, ordinary moments unfolding in familiar ways, none of them aware that the quiet woman among them had spent the last few hours documenting something that would ripple far beyond this flight. Back at the airport she had departed from, the day continued as it always did, but within a secured office, Rachel Green finalized her report, her fingers moving steadily across the keyboard as she outlined the sequence of events, each detail recorded with clarity, not to assign blame, but to ensure that what had been revealed would not be overlooked. She paused briefly before completing the final line, her eyes lingering on the screen as if acknowledging that the lesson was not in the error itself, but in the awareness it had created. Mark Sullivan finished his shift under the same bright lights where everything had unfolded, but as he removed his badge and stepped into the quieter corridor beyond the checkpoint, the weight of the day remained with him, not as regret, but as a quiet recalibration of how he would carry his role forward. He replayed the moment again, not to change it, but to understand it, recognizing that the difference between routine and respect was not found in the procedure, but in the space before it began. The aircraft touched down smoothly, tires meeting the runway with a controlled certainty, and as it taxied toward the gate, Olivia finally shifted her focus from the window, her attention returning to the present with the same calm clarity that had defined every moment of her journey. When the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers rose quickly, eager to exit, reaching for bags, stepping into the aisle, but Olivia remained seated just a second longer, allowing the rush to pass before she stood, her movements deliberate, her presence quiet but unmistakably grounded. She stepped into the aisle and moved forward with the flow, no different from anyone else, yet entirely defined by something deeper than what could be seen. As she exited the aircraft and entered the terminal, The noise of a new city surrounded her, announcements echoing, footsteps blending into a constant rhythm. But she did not pause, did not look back, because there was nothing behind her that required acknowledgement, only the continuation of a path shaped by awareness, not assumption. And somewhere miles away, under the same bright lights of another terminal, a man who once relied on instinct now understood the cost of it, not through reprimand, but through silence, the kind that lingers long after words have faded. And in that silence, a simple truth remained, steady and unspoken, that respect is not something given to those who appear deserving, but something owed to everyone until proven otherwise, and that sometimes the most powerful lessons arrive quietly, leaving behind nothing but a changed perspective and a world that, for a moment, learns to see more clearly.